Good morning, Broadview. How are you? Going well, I hope. My name's Chris, and it's my great privilege to share God's word with you this morning. I want to ask you a question. Have you ever lied to make yourself look good? Have you ever lied to impress? Have you ever lied to make yourself feel good about yourself? Because if you say no, you're doing it right now. We've all done it, haven't we? It's part of our human nature. Have you ever felt slighted, ignored, not rated? Have any of you got that song, What About Me, on replay in your head? You know that song? You're standing in the queue. Can you hurry up? Why did that person get the promotion? Why can't everyone see how good I am? What about me? What about me? Have you ever said, if only, if only, if only I were a bit taller, a bit shorter, a bit narrower, shall we say. If only I was just a bit better at something. If only. Have you ever thought that? Have you ever said that to yourself? If only. It's the cry of the human heart, isn't it? It is the cry of the human heart for approval and acknowledgement, isn't it? We all crave that. Our problem is that we often look in the wrong places, don't we? For that affirmation, for that acknowledgement. We come out unsatisfied and then we go somewhere else and we come out unsatisfied as well. So the story of Jacob is one of those stories. And I think it's got something really important to teach us this morning, so listen up. Get your pens out. Write it down. There's some great messages in this story about Jacob this morning. And my prayer is that we'll get a glimpse of what God has to say to us today. So, to recap, we're in week 3, well done, of a 5-week series about Jacob. And in the last couple of weeks, we've looked at Jacob's encounter with God in a dream, where he used a rock for a pillow, which was interesting, wasn't it? And then last week we had a bit of a look at how Jacob responded to that dream and how he grew in faith and trust. And we've heard in the last couple of weeks that Jacob's a bit of a, he's a bit of a conniver. He's a bit of a schemer. Anyone in the room who's a bit of a schemer, always got a plan, always looking to do something different, better? That's what Jacob was like. And Jacob was so in need of his father's blessing that he tricked Esau. You remember that story? He tricked Isaac into giving him the blessing that was due to Esau. And as any sibling worth their salt, Esau was furious. He was furious. He wanted to kill Jacob. Do you remember that? He wanted to kill him. So Jacob ran away. So this week we're having a bit of a look at a really short passage in Genesis 32. And it's a really fascinating passage. It's centred around a wrestling match. And this one leaves WWE in the shade. It really does. This is a wrestling match between Jacob and God. And it reflects our own self-reliance and God's relentless love for us. It is raw and real. Last time I checked, WWE is not raw or real. So let's get the context straight here. In Genesis 31, God has commanded Jacob to return to his homeland. Good news. Bad news is he's going to have to meet up with Esau 20 years down the track after he stole his birthright. So that's going to be interesting, isn't it? So at the start of Genesis 32, we see Jacob, and he meets a whole bunch of angels. God sends him some angels to reassure him of his protection and his provision. And Jacob is preparing to meet Esau 20 years down the track. And Jacob, ever the schemer, puts in place a strategy. He figures that he might need to appease Esau. He might need to do something nice for him. So he sends a whole bunch of messengers out to meet Esau. Basically to say, me, Jacob, I'm rich. I've got plenty of money. It's all good. The message comes back from Esau that he's coming with 400 men to meet Jacob. 400. Not a couple, 400. So this is going to get really interesting. I'm sure Jacob is thinking this is not going to be a happy reunion. So he goes to plan B. Plan A didn't work, plan B. So instead of trusting God, who just, by the way, sent a bunch of angels to reassure him. So, short memory, like all of us. And that was a visible and tangible sign that God was going to protect Jacob. He had that. Instead of trusting in God, he trusts in his own scheming. And he goes, I've got an idea. I know what I'll do. I'll split my people up into two so that if Esau attacks, only half of them will die. That's a pretty good plan, isn't it? That's a pretty good plan. But then in verses 9 to 12, so I'm still getting to the wrestling match, so stay with me, okay? I just want to give you some background because it's really important you understand what's been going on. In verses 9 to 12, something happens to Jacob. And so instead of scheming, he prays. He prays. Jacob's fear leads him to a humble and thankful prayer. He gets down on his knees and he says to God, remember your faithfulness. Remember your promises to me. I need you. He's holding on to God. Then he gets up from his prayer and what does he do? Remarkably, he goes straight back to his scheming. Plan C. I know what I'll do. I'm going to send a veritable zoo of my animals out to meet Esau with my servants, and I'll say it's a gift from me, again as a way to appease. Isn't that just like us? We say, I'll surrender all my goats. If I have to, if that's not enough, I'll surrender all my sheep. Okay, if I have to, if that's not enough, I'll surrender all my camels. We do it unwillingly. So to this point, Jacob has encountered God and he's grown in his faith, but he's refused to surrender himself fully, to fully trust in God's promises and provisions. So that's the lead up to the wrestling match. Have you got it? Interesting, eh? So in those first 20 odd verses of Genesis 32, we've seen a fair few things happening. We've seen a combination of days of our lives, Bold and the Beautiful, Home and Away, Neighbours, Farmers, Maths, and every other bad TV show you've ever seen. We've seen trust in our own ability to fix things. We've seen sudden periods of trust in God and then sudden lack of trust in God. We've seen attempts to find favour and impress. We've seen fear and self-interest. And we've seen really bad short-term memory about God's promises. And I find it really interesting when you look at the Bible. All of the central characters in the Bible, bar Jesus, are broken, frail, make really poor decisions. They've got bad morals. They get it wrong a lot of the time. You know what that tells me about the Bible? It's actually true. There's no messing around here. This is humanity in its real form. And I have to remind you that God doesn't save us because we are good. God saves us because he is good. So, we're getting to the story, the wrestling match. Here we go. Let's pick up Genesis 32, 22 to 26, which will come up on the screen. Thanks. Reading from the NIV. So Jacob wrestles with God. That night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Have you ever wrestled with your children? Hands up if you've wrestled with your children. Yeah. It's hard not to, isn't it? And you wrestle with your children and you put just enough resistance up so you don't hurt them, but it's fun and it's a great bonding exercise. I recommend it if you haven't tried it already. And actually, I stopped wrestling with my boys when I looked in their eyes. 2 boys. And I figured out that they knew they could take me. So I stopped. And I diverted attention to something that I could probably sort of keep up with them about. What's going on here? This is one of the more bizarre stories in the Bible. Jacob wrestling with God. What a strange, magnificent picture it is. God in human form wrestles with Jacob. So what on earth is going on here? So many questions, right? So many questions. Why is God wrestling with Jacob in the first place? What's he doing? Why is God not beating Jacob by merely lifting his little pinky? Why is he not doing that? Why does Jacob, who, by the way, is old enough to qualify for free camel transport in the public transport system back then, he's that old, why does he seem to match it? Why does he match it with God? How does Jacob, at his advanced age, match it? Why didn't God just get him in the full Nelson in the first 2 minutes? Why does he dislocate his hip? Why does it go on for so long? And why does Jacob not want to let go when the day breaks? Now, I can't guarantee I'm going to answer all of those questions, but we've all got those sort of questions about this really interesting, it's actually a beautiful passage. So let's just pick up 7 points very quickly, and they'll just come up on the screen, and I'm just going to go through them pretty quickly. But we see in chapter 22 and 23 that Jacob is vulnerable. He's sent his wife, his servants, and all his possessions across the river. If Esau turns up now, he's done. So he's vulnerable. He's alone. It says Jacob was alone at the start of verse 24. So God finally has Jacob alone so he can deal with him. Jacob was a schemer and he had a lot of things going on. He was always busy, never stopped. Now he's alone in the darkness. God can deal with him. Here was Jacob meeting Esau tomorrow, not knowing what's happened to those that he sent out ahead. He can't go back to the old life. He's been commanded to go back to his homeland, so he's stuck. He's stuck. So he's out of ideas. He had lots of them, but he's out of ideas now. He's at death's door. He's about to meet Esau. This really is the dark night of Jacob's soul. There's no more plans, there's no more strategies, there's no more ideas, no more schemes. He's done. Then remarkably, he has a personal encounter with God. And this is the wrestling match. So here at the very moment of Jacob's darkest hour, God meets him. Let's read that again. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And it's no accident that it says the man, who is God incarnate, wrestled with Jacob. God initiated it, as he does with everything he does with us. God, in his relentless love, initiates this wrestling match. Jacob was not looking for it. So, we have Jacob being vulnerable, alone, out of ideas. He has a personal encounter with God. He's stubborn. He's stubborn. Not at all like us. He's stubborn. Charles Spurgeon says about this wrestling match, "It was brave of Jacob thus to wrestle, but there was too much of self about it. It was his own sufficiency that was wrestling with the God-man Jesus." And the match goes till daybreak. I reckon that tells us that when we are God is trying to bring our self-sufficiency under his rule and reign, it's going to take more than 5 minutes. This goes all night, this wrestling match, in the dark. And God will so often wait for the surrender of our will, for the reliance on all the other things that we so desperately seek as humans. He'll wait for that to run out. And this is where he got to with Jacob. You see, Jacob was mistaken if he thought it was Esau that was the barrier for him to get his blessing. It was actually his own self-reliance, his own self-will, his own reliance on his own plans and schemes and not on God. That was the barrier to the blessing. So, Jacob is wounded. What's that all about? Jacob's wounded. Why did God do that? To draw Jacob in. Finally, and for the first time, Jacob is broken. He's wounded in his strength. If you're in a wrestling match and you've got a dislocated hip, you have a problem. You have a problem. So he's wounded in his strength. His sense of competency is wounded. His pride is humbled. He can't manufacture victory. He can't scheme his way out of this. He's got an injury that will prevent him from ever being able to win in his own strength. But isn't it interesting? We all want to change, don't we? We all know deep down we need to change. We need to draw near to God. But none of us want to be wounded, do we? None of us want to be wounded. So when Jacob first engaged in the wrestling match, he was using all of his stubborn self-will. He was fighting with all he had, all his reliance, all about me. And then there's a turning point. Once his hip is touched and dislocated, he becomes a clinging child. Totally and utterly dependent on God, to the extent that he wouldn't let him go. Sinclair Ferguson says about this passage, "Do you see that in order to have Jacob's heart, God is prepared to dislocate his hip? In order to have Jacob's heart, God is prepared to dislocate his hip." And Derek Kidner, who I'm sure you've all heard of, his commentary on Genesis says, "When God touched Jacob's socket, it was defeat and victory. all wrapped up in one. It was defeat and victory because Jacob's response to the impairment, his response to the out-of-joint suffering that God had brought into his life, was the defeat that brings victory, because in it, Jacob clings to God. And lastly, Jacob enters the blessing. So up until now, Jacob has sought the blessing without seeking the blesser. That's the problem here. Jacob was beginning to see that all his striving was in vain, and he needed to seek God alone. Not seek God as a means to an end, but seek God as an end in himself. See, the blessing of God must be obtained from God himself, and it must be done by clinging to him in helpless dependence. Jacob would not let the man go until he got his blessing. So for such a long time, Jacob was relentless in his search of the blessing from his father and right throughout his life. And that search for blessing took him away from God. Now God's relentless love is teaching Jacob that God himself is the blessing. That is who Jacob must seek. Are you still with me? Good, 2 people. No, joking. So I'm just going to start to wrap it up. I've just got a little bit to go. So just to try and bring all that together. Wrestling's not physical alone, is it? Wrestling is emotional, spiritual, and physical. And I reckon everyone in this room has wrestled with God. Probably lots. And it's usually when God is teaching us something through the Bible or convicting us of something and we don't want to change. We think we can do it better our way. So think to yourself, have you wrestled with God? And what's that been about? Tim Keller says, you want to change? God sometimes has to wrestle us into a changed life rather than comfort us into a changed life. He has to wrestle us in, and in love, he had to wrestle Jacob in. God delighted in Jacob. God loved Jacob. No one could snatch Jacob out of the Lord's hands. And it was because God loved him that he wrestled him into a changed life. Do you see that? It's because God loves us that he wrestles us into that life. Because he loves us. And if you look back at those 4 or 5 verses, when did the change in Jacob happen? It happened in the moment of pain, didn't it? It happened in the moment of pain. See, God's not punishing Jacob. He's preparing him for what's next. And the message here is that God very often uses pain to transform our lives, to change our hearts. God's going after Jacob's heart, and he dislocates his hip as a way to get into his heart. And Jacob ended up having a limp as a reminder of that encounter. So I want to ask you this morning, have you ever had your plans or your dreams dislocated? Have you ever had your life put out of joint by God? Are you prepared to limp, maybe, for the rest of your life, as God asks you to lay down your self-reliance and your self-will to follow him? And as you think about that, I just want to stand back for 2 minutes, I promise. And I want to talk about how this story and many stories and pictures and images in the Old Testament point us to the cross of Christ. And they show us God's relentless love of sinners like you and me. You see, the whole Bible narrative points us to Jesus and the cross. Old Testament, New Testament. The whole story is pointing us to the cross. God in human form comes to Jacob and he wrestles him. We're told that he couldn't overcome Jacob. Now we know that that's not true. Of course God could have overcome Jacob. In a sense, God came in human form in weakness to Jacob. He put aside his mighty power. He came in weakness to Jacob. And over 1,000 years later, Jesus came to earth. He took the form of a human. He laid aside his mighty power. And in weakness, he died on the cross. You see, on the cross, Jesus allowed himself to be overcome, to take the curse of our sin, to give us the blessing of God. See, Jesus was the ultimate Jacob. We can only meet Jesus because he became weak for us. Jesus was cursed when he should have got the blessing, so that we can have the blessing when we should have the curse. It's when you see that your heart will change. It's when you take that truth into your heart about what Jesus did for us on the cross, that your heart will melt. See, God's objective with Jacob and God's objective with us is a changed heart. Jesus wrestled with the full weight of our sins, and he took the full weight of God's justice. But he held on in order to get the blessing for us. That is all we need. No more striving, no more scheming, no more working. The grace of God in Jesus is all we need. And if we meditate and we pray and we worship about that gospel truth, our hearts will be changed. One more sentence. Next week, and then I'm going to pray after that too. Next week, the story of Jacob continues. Make sure you hear episode 4. Episode 4. And it's fantastic because we go from the wrestling match to what God did with Jacob. He gave him a new name and a new identity. It's a really fantastic story. So please be here next week to hear about that. Stay tuned. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your relentless love for us. We thank you that it is all of grace, that even though we are sinners, like Jacob, like so many in the Bible, your relentless love pursues us. You will not let us go. You sent Jesus. You gave up your only Son. You sent him to this earth to live, and die, and be resurrected, so that we could have the blessing of knowing you. So, Father, may that truth melt our hearts today. May it change our lives. We pray all these things